Hi, everybody. This is Kara Thrasher-Livingston with Senior and Disability Services, and I'm here to welcome you to our webinar today. I can go ahead and give folks a few reminders about how to participate in the webinar, and then we'll have our wonderful guest speaker today and sharing information with us about individuals who experience IDD and Alzheimer's disease. Let's go ahead and take a look at our webinar itself. I just want to make sure that folks can hear me. I know that many of us have been in webinars before, but just as a quick reminder, there's a couple of controls that you can see on your screen as a participant. One of them is going to be a little orange square with a white arrow in it where you open up a place where you can type in your comments and your questions. The other one is a little hand with a circle around it, or just a little button that looks like a hand. I like to ask us to go ahead and practice hitting that hand. That's how you raise your hand in the webinar, just so I know everybody can hear me okay. And I can see all the little hands go up. Good job, everybody. And I know that you can hear me, so that's awesome. You can either lower the hand yourself, or you might see me lower the hand like that. It might say instructor that lowered the hand. You can see us on your computer screen or your device, your phone, your tablet, or your desktop, or your laptop. It works on all of those. Don't close out the big display there. That's where our presentation is going to be. You may be listening to us on a telephone or on the computer itself. That's perfectly fine either way. It works either way. We are recording the session, and we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel at a later date. Give us about a week or a little bit more to get that going. Also, we can share materials with you after the session. Give us, again, about a week to get all the information together to send to you. So I want to thank everybody here for coming to our session. We have myself, Kara Thrasher-Livingston. We have Cassandra Lynch, Stina Fisher, and Delight Mills from our trainer team. And, of course, we have Linda Shepard to present she's from Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska to present about this topic. This is worth 2 hours of care coordinator, CEH. We hope to get your engagement with your questions. You type them into the question area because your audio is muted. So feel free to go ahead and type them in during the session, and we'll get to them when it's time for Q&A. We might do Q&A in between. Who knows? We're just kind of go for it. Okay, so all that being said, I just want to go ahead and ask you to take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this invitation to be here today. And I've learned a lot as we prepared for this presentation. And so, again, thanks for the invite. So the next slide will just show the objectives that Delight and Kara had asked that we address. And so these are some of the things that we're going to talk about this morning. And so as we look at the next slide, this really is talking about when neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative disorders overlap. The onset of dementia causes people with IDD and their caregivers and their primary providers to navigate between two systems. Each system has been developed around a specific group experiencing aging services and IDD services. The Administration on Aging is funding efforts to improve home and community-based services for people with IDD and dementia and their caregivers. The hope is to develop a dementia-capable and culturally competent system of care across agencies and organizations. But the question is, how do we become dementia-capable? So the things that will help us to become dementia-capable are understanding this intersect between neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative disorders, being able to identify the early signs of dementia, utilizing non-pharmacologic approaches to address behavioral symptoms of the disease process, and identifying ways to support professional and family caregivers, and then bridging these aging and IDD networks. And I really wanted to speak to the fact that you've taken the initiative to do this, and so it's just excellent. So it's complicated. complicated. Even though we are making great strides in understanding the neurological system through genetics and brain imaging, we are still really pioneers. It's just the tip of the iceberg in our quest for knowledge about brain science. But the real work of the brain goes on in the individual cells. The adult brain contains about 100 billion nerve cells, or what we call neurons, with branches that connect at more than 100 trillion points. These neurons are the chief type of cell that are destroyed by the neurodegenerative disorders. So first, we need to understand the terms that we're using. If we break down the word neurodegenerative, you can see that we are talking about conditions where the nerve cells or these neurons degenerate or die. There is damage to or loss of nerve cells and their connections in the brain. People experience different symptoms depending on the area of the brain that is affected by the damage. The term dementia does not describe a specific disease, but rather a wide range of symptoms associated with neurodegeneration, and the decline in memory or other thinking skills severe enough that impacts a person's ability to perform everyday activities. Symptoms usually develop slowly and get worse over time. The distinction between the terms dementia and Alzheimer's disease is often confusing for clients, families, and caregivers. So it helps to see that the word dementia is actually a general umbrella term that describes a variety of more specific neurodegenerative conditions that permanently affect memory and thinking. Alzheimer's disease is the cause of the most common form of dementia that falls under this umbrella, and it is distinguished from the other causes of dementia based on its specific characteristics. Practically speaking, the words dementia and Alzheimer's disease are often used interchangeably, both in medical settings and in general conversations. This usage is not wholly incorrect, but it commonly causes confusion for people who are unfamiliar with how the two entities relate to one another. For the remainder of this presentation, the term Alzheimer's disease and dementia will be used, but do keep in mind that Alzheimer's disease is just one specific cause of dementia. There are many different kinds of dementia. In fact, experts suggest that there are over 75 different types. So next, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the 4 common types of dementia to include Alzheimer's disease, so that you can see that even though they are all considered dementia, they are really all quite different. So vascular dementia is a decline in thinking skills caused by cerebrovascular disease, and a condition in which blood vessels in the brain are damaged and brain tissue injured, depriving brain cells of vital oxygen and nutrients. Inadequate blood flow can damage and eventually kill cells anywhere in the body. The brain has one of the body's richest networks of blood vessels and is especially vulnerable. In vascular dementia, changes in thinking skills sometimes occur suddenly following a major stroke that blocks major brain blood vessels. Thinking problems also may begin as with mild changes that worsen gradually as a result of multiple minor strokes or other conditions that affect the smaller blood vessels, leading to accumulative damage. Actually, a growing number of experts are referring to the term vascular cognitive impairment rather than vascular dementia because they feel it better expresses the concept that vascular thinking changes can range from mild to severe. Another important thing to note is that vascular brain changes often coexist with changes linked to other types of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body dementia. Several studies have found that vascular changes and other brain abnormalities may interact in ways that increase the likelihood of a dementia diagnosis. So vascular dementia is widely considered the second most common type of dementia after Alzheimer's disease, accounting for about 5% to 10% of cases. The next type of dementia is Lewy body dementia, also known as dementia with Lewy bodies. It's another common type of progressive dementia. What happens here is that protein deposits called Lewy bodies develop in nerve cells in the brain regions involved in thinking, memory, and movement, or motor control. Lewy body dementia causes a progressive decline in mental abilities. People with Lewy body dementia may experience visual hallucinations and changes in alertness and attention. Other effects include Parkinson's disease-like symptoms, such as rigid muscles, slow movement, and tremors. People living with Lewy body disease are especially sensitive to medications like Haldol and even over-the-counter medications like Benadryl or Tylenol PM. It can cause problems with hallucinations. So this is just one example of why it's important for a person to be diagnosed and know the type of dementia that they are living with. It really impacts the care and progression. Another very common type, or more of the four, is frontotemporal dementias. And actually, frontotemporal is actually another umbrella term for a family of brain diseases, about 20 different ones that are very uncommon, but primarily affect the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, the areas generally associated with personality, behavior, and language. Which lobe and which part of the lobe determines which symptoms are seen first. If damage occurs in the part of the temporal lobe that connects emotions to objects, person may not recognize potentially dangerous objects. So for instance, like a pot of boiling water. So a lot of safety concerns. In FTD, portions of these lobes shrink, or what we call atrophy, and signs and symptoms vary depending upon the portion of the brain affected. Some people with FTD undergo dramatic changes in their personality and become what we call socially inappropriate. Their social filter isn't there, impulsive or emotionally indifferent, kind of that apathetic effect, and while others lose their ability to use language. The FTD dementia is often misdiagnosed as a psychiatric problem or as Alzheimer's disease, but FTD tends to occur at a younger age than does Alzheimer's disease, generally between the ages of 40 and 45. And then that brings us to Alzheimer's disease, which is by far the most common type of dementia, with estimates of 60 to 70% of all the dementias. There is both an early onset and a late onset. Early onset is before the age of 65 and is often linked to real distinct genetic cause. Over 65 occurs as the person ages, and there's still many things that we're learning. In Alzheimer's disease, it is the neurons that are affected, both inside the nerve cell and between the neurons. And so you may have heard of this plaques and tangles associated with Alzheimer's disease and wondering, well, what are those? So the plaques are clusters of protein fragments that collect outside of the nerve cells in the brain, and this disrupts the signaling between the neurons. The neurons are unable to send messages back and forth. And so you can see the difference here between a healthy neuron cell and those affected by Alzheimer's disease. The next slide shows tangles, which actually occur inside the cell body, caused by the breakdown of a protein called tau. Tau helps to uphold the cell structure. It's kind of the scaffolding. But as it breaks down, it begins to unravel and clump together, forming tangled masses inside the cell. And you can kind of see by this tissue slide that there's sometimes where a message could make it through. I kind of call that a train track, and other times where the message stops. And this is why we see the different kinds of symptoms that people experience with Alzheimer's disease. So scientists are not absolutely sure what causes the cell death and tissue loss in Alzheimer's in the brain, but these plaques and tangles are the prime suspects. Alzheimer's disease affects the brain and causes the observed changes in dementia, such as memory loss, functional decline, behavior and personality changes, and loss of language skills. Over time, this results in a substantial loss of neurons, and the brain atrophies or shrinks, as you can see in the picture on the right of this brain autopsy. So what's the connection? So research shows that age-related health problems among people with IDD are similar to those in the general population, including the development of dementia in later life. However, the prevalence of dementia in people with Down syndrome who are in middle to early older age is higher than in the general population. Hence, the incidence of dementia in older people with Down syndrome is up to 5 times higher than older adults in the general population. Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome share a unique genetic connection. In the typical population, people who have 2 copies of each chromosome to equal a total of 46. You can recall in Down syndrome, individuals have a full or partial third copy of chromosome 21. Chromosome 21 carries a gene for that protein that is produced in excess in Alzheimer's disease, leading to the buildup of this beta amyloid, or this protein responsible for forming the plaques that cause permanent damage to the brain cells. Since individuals with Down syndrome carry 3 copies of this chromosome in their cells, they have an additional overproduction of this brain toxic protein. Scientists are still working to fully understand the role of all the other genes located on chromosome 21, as several of them are felt to contribute to the accelerated aging process that is also seen in Down syndrome. This unique property of chromosome 21 are associated with elevated risk of premature Alzheimer's disease for adults with Down syndrome specifically. The risk is not seen as distinctly in adults with other forms of intellectual disability. One of the most serious and life-changing concerns that individuals with Down syndrome face as they grow older is this increased risk for developing dementia. For anyone receiving the news for the first time, the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease can be overwhelming. Families and caregivers of adults with Down syndrome can find this diagnosis particularly difficult, as it is often marked by a grief for the loss of abilities that have been so hard-earned over the lifetime, in the individual's lifetime. And no matter how informed one might be about the increased risk of Alzheimer's disease in Down syndrome, many people feel unprepared when the diagnosis becomes a reality. Family members, loved ones, and caregivers may find themselves in a state of disbelief when they witness changes occurring under their own roof, or when the diagnosis is officially made in someone they love. This can be a very emotional time as individuals, caregivers, and families work to fully grasp the implications and impact of this diagnosis. While it is well established that there is an elevated risk of Alzheimer's disease in adults with Down syndrome as they grow older, it is very important to emphasize that this diagnosis is not inevitable. For reasons that are still not fully understood, some individuals with Down syndrome will develop Alzheimer's disease as they grow older, and some will not. Current estimates suggest that Alzheimer's disease affects more than about 30% of people with Down syndrome in their 50s and 50% or more of people in their 60s, with the risk increasing incrementally with advancing age thereafter. But what we do want to stress is that dementia is not normal aging. Okay? And so once again, it is not inevitable, but we do want to know about that increased risk. So a diagnosis for someone with IDD is like walking a tightrope. There is an old tired saying said, if it looks like a duck, it must be a duck. However, when it comes to making a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome or IDD, it is best to stay away from any assumptions. There are too many times the diagnosis is made before it should be. We need to be careful of diagnostic overshadowing, which is also called, would be a misdiagnosis. We need to rule out other issues that could be causing symptoms that mimic Alzheimer's disease or dementias. When people think of Alzheimer's, usually the first thought is loss of memory. However, for people with Down syndrome, behavioral symptoms are typically noticed before memory issues are seen. Other losses may include language difficulties, inability to identify objects, or difficulty with routine tasks. But a misdiagnosis can be just as problematic. Therefore, to become dementia-capable, it is imperative that we are aware of what are some common medical conditions in aging adults with IDD that could cause symptoms that can be misdiagnosed as dementia. We also need to know the early warning signs of dementia to ensure an accurate diagnosis. So let's take a look at those now. So what is normal aging and what is not? So some signs of early dementia or Alzheimer's would be memory loss that disrupts daily life, confusion or forgetfulness in a recurrent pattern, enough to interfere with some aspects of the individual's typical daily routine. Some early on forgetfulness typically involves difficulty recalling immediate, short-term, or newly learned information. Individuals may show new or worsened difficulty with activities that require multiple steps or tasks of sequencing and planning that they would previously have been able to do. Examples could include repeatedly forgetting to bring a towel or other necessary items into the bathroom for a shower, or only, putting one thing in their lunchbox or leaving for the day, or dressing in shorts to leave for work when it's snowing outside, those kinds of things. Other things, difficulty completing familiar tasks at home, work, or leisure, such as a decreased work productivity or confusion about completing common household or leisure tasks that he or she once could previously do. There may be an overall appearance of poor concentration when attempting to do a chore or a familiar daily activity. Confusion with time or place. An individual with dementia and may have early memory problems, may appear confused about where he or she is, or may lose track of the day, of the week, or appear less familiar with typical daily routine. And also visual images and spatial relationships. Even just seeing the difference between, for instance, maybe carpeting and a linoleum floor, steps, and things like that. There might be some new problems with words in speaking or writing. Speaking or language may become more bland or simple. Vocabulary and word choice may become more limited. And difficulty in understanding language may lead to some difficulty answering questions or following directions. Also, misplacing things and losing the ability to retrace the steps. We all lose our car keys and things, but individuals may appear more absent-minded and apt to misplace or lose items. Examples may include no longer putting a lunchbox away in its usual place in the kitchen, or maybe an open jar of mayonnaise in a cupboard, or dirty clothes mixed into the drawer with clean clothes. I have to admit I'm guilty about all those things.
Yeah.
But when individuals become more forgetful of where something was put down and they're unable to, again, retrace their steps, that's when we might be concerned. Or decreased and poor judgment. With early memory changes, they may forget to lock their front door or turn off the stove or those sorts of things. And if we're seeing a pattern of those. Another thing is withdrawal from social activities. They might start avoiding social opportunities due to the anxiety and stress or confusion about and having to interact with people. It might feel like too much. Activities that they may once have, really enjoyed may suddenly just seem overwhelming for them. And then some changes in mood and personality, new or worsening negative emotions. And sometimes we might even see some, if they put something somewhere and then it's lost, there might be some things with suspicion or paranoia, and of course anxiety and tearfulness, and that can lead to depression. So next, let's look at some of the common medical conditions that people living with intellectual disabilities and Down syndrome experience. And as we go through these, be aware of how certain signs and symptoms might be interpreted for symptoms of dementia. So the first one is obstructive sleep apnea. Adults with IDD are at increased risk for sleep apnea, a sleep disorder that leads to poor quality and non-restorative sleep. Signs of possible sleep apnea include snoring, gasping noises, daytime sleepiness, morning fatigue or that difficulty getting out of bed, excessive napping, and fragmented sleep. Undiagnosed or untreated sleep apnea can lead to symptoms of irritability, poor concentration, behavior changes, and impaired attention. It can also put a strain on the heart and the lungs and cause high blood pressure. Sleep apnea can be detected with a sleep study, and in some cases, sleep testing can be arranged at home. And so sleep apnea is commonly undetected, but you can see where some of those symptoms could be misinterpreted or missed and not addressed. Hypothyroidism, the thyroid gland is involved in various metabolic processes, controlling how quickly the body uses energy and makes proteins and regulates hormones. Thyroid dysfunction is common in adults with Down syndrome and can lead to symptoms of fatigue, mental sluggishness, weight fluctuations, and irritability. Thyroid dysfunction is easily detected via a screening blood test that can be performed by a primary care doctor, and treatment will usually involve taking thyroid medications that regulates the abnormal hormone levels. And again, you can see these symptoms, which is it? Celiac disease is another one that is a common condition for people with Down syndrome. And this is a condition that where people cannot digest wheat, gluten, and wheat products, causing damage to the lining of the intestine and preventing absorption of certain nutrients. And when this disease is present, it can cause GI distress, nutritional deficiencies, and sometimes general irritability and behavior changes. Again, there's a higher risk of this condition in individuals, especially with Down syndrome. But this can be screened with a blood test, requires a biopsy and evaluation of the small intestine to confirm the diagnosis. But a visit to a gastroenterology specialist is usually necessary to make that diagnosis, but it can be treated. Other kinds of things, musculoskeletal conditions, people with Down syndrome are typically hyperflexible. Over the years, they can put a lot of, and that can, over the years, put a lot of increased stress and wear and tear on the larger joints, like their hips and knees. This leads to increased risk of osteoarthritis. Arthritis is painful and can lead to decreased mobility and decreased willingness to participate in activities. For some individuals, the pain can express itself through negative behavioral changes. The instability and the cervical spine disease create an increased risk of instability and an increased risk of damage to the spinal cord in that region. And a gradual narrowing of the spinal canal may also occur due to the developmental of severe arthritic changes in the bones of the spine, and this is called spinal stenosis, so they may have that going on. When chronic changes occur in the cervical spine that affect the spinal cord, symptoms can include weakness in the arms or hands and walking abnormalities, or even incontinence can be observed from those. So again, you can see where we're having to look at all these symptoms and determine which is which. Sensory losses. Adults with Down syndrome are at risk of early cataracts, and cataracts cause a clouding of the lens of the eye and produce a blurring and impaired vision. A keratoconus can also cause a round cornea to become cone-shaped, which can lead to a distortion of vision. Both of these conditions can be screened for by the eye doctor and should be assessed for regularly. And then adults with Down syndrome are also at higher risk for a conductive hearing loss. In addition, they tend to have a little bit smaller ear canal and frequently have earwax impactions that can impair their hearing. Routine ear examinations can assess for wax impactions, and periodic screening with an audiologist can formally assess hearing loss. Undiagnosed sensory impairments, whether it be vision or hearing, are frequently mistaken as stubbornness, confusion, or disorientation in adults with IDD. These conditions are quite common, and when properly identified, can be greatly improved with glasses, hearing aids, ear cleanings, and environmental adaptation. And finally, mental health disorders. As adults with Down syndrome grow older, there is an increased risk of experiencing certain common mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and behavioral disturbances. A sudden or abrupt change in mood or behavior pattern warrants further investigation. A thorough medical assessment is recommended to look for any new and potentially correctable physical or medical conditions that could be contributing to these problems. Psychiatric illnesses can have a different feature in adults with IDD and Down syndrome. Thus, an evaluation from a mental health provider with special training or expertise in both adults with intellectual disabilities and dementia is recommended. In addition to medical and psychological contributors to mood changes, it's important to be sensitive to any significant change in the environment or the social structure. Pay attention to any recent emotional upheavals that the individual may be experiencing. I read one case study where a mom, they were concerned about her son, and they had diagnosed him with dementia, Alzheimer's, and it actually was related to depression because of a loss of a housemate that he'd had over years. And so when they really looked at the symptoms, it was depression and not dementia, and he'd actually been misdiagnosed. So the importance of an accurate diagnosis. So you can see that the diagnosis of any form of dementia is based primarily on clinical information, the history, the signs and symptoms that are brought to the attention of a healthcare provider. Currently, there is not one laboratory test, neuropsychological exam, X-ray, or brain scan that can make the diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. It really is only confirmed on autopsy. Instead, the determination falls primarily to the healthcare provider, who is assessing the individual and making a judgment about whether there is enough evidence to support a dementia diagnosis. Making a dementia diagnosis in adults with Down syndrome can seem rather daunting for many healthcare providers because of the variety of factors, the inherent variability of the baseline intellectual ability, the lack of standardized diagnostic tests, and the lack of specialty training among healthcare providers. Currently, the best assessment starts with a well-informed review of the individual's history, accounting for long-standing baseline abilities and a description of how and when these abilities started to change. So in summary, it's imperative that we're aware of conditions that may be either causing directly or contributing to the changes observed, while also working to confirm that the key changes identified are indeed suggestive of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. The following sections will provide a basic framework about seeking out a thoughtful and thorough assessment to help caregivers advocate for an accurate and careful diagnosis. And I really see that being a big role for care coordinators. And so we'll be talking about some tools for that. So diagnosis is based on inclusion and exclusion. Alzheimer's disease, in other words, the evidence supporting a diagnosis must include a convincing history, progressive loss of memory skills compared to one's baseline functioning, and should exclude all other possible conditions that could have caused the changes observed. If any coexisting medical or psychiatric conditions are identified, efforts must focus on treating them to the fullest extent possible. So the typical steps in screening diagnosis for someone without IDD or who is not living with Down syndrome would be to, they identify some memory problems, they go to the doctor, and the doctor does a quick in-the-office screening, and we call these the MMSE, a memory screening test, or mini-cog, or clock drawing. There's another one called the AD8. But for people living with IDD, these assessments need to be adapted, or they might not be able to be used at all. And so that's one thing to be considering. So we'll be talking about some tools that we can use, but the other part of the screening will be a diagnostic workup to rule out any reversible causes, some brain imaging, CT, a CAT scan, or MRI. Usually a PET scan is not done. Those are very, very expensive and are being used more for research than anything. Then you can see all the blood tests that are done. And then finally, some neuropsychological testing. So again, because this diagnosis is one of inclusion and exclusion, it's imperative to have a strong and valid baseline assessment. The importance of a baseline assessment because the individual's history is the cornerstone of the diagnosis. Recall that the diagnosis is not based on a single test result or brain scan, but instead on the medical provider's assessment of all the symptoms taken into context for each individual. A core feature of dementia diagnosis is the progressive loss of memory and other daily skills that represent a decline. Therefore, any judgments made by a medical provider must be based on some basic understanding of what comprised the individual's baseline ability throughout their lifetime. So the recognition of progressive change from these baseline activities is the cornerstone. So the tools that we can use to identify patterns of change include documenting baseline abilities, and so we'll talk about that. Then we'll take a look at the baseline current abilities worksheet, which is a narrative format allowing the caregiver or family caregiver or family members to describe in detail typical patterns. And finally, we'll move on to the NTG or detection screen. What I'd like you to do is just take a moment to think of a particular client that you have and how you might use these tools. It's also helpful to think about using these tools for individuals who are doing well, not that you're suspecting a problem. And if they're showing no signs of change or concern, in that way, these tools are highly useful for documenting baseline proactively. So think about your clients and who might be, who you might want to use these with. So the first tool is documenting baseline abilities, and I would imagine that you do a lot of this too in your care coordination. But just to review, there can be simple ways to informally collect objective examples of a person's baseline abilities. Writing samples, drawing, art projects, math worksheets, and personal journals can be valuable pieces of information and be a reference of baseline skills. A collection of this information could also be done in other forms, like a video or recording of the individual performing typical activities, like swimming, singing, using the computer, counting coins, or helping make cookies. Compiling a scrapbook of abilities and achievements over one's adult life can be a very positive and fun activity, and also create this baseline to be able to observe any changes. And then some subjective examples refer to a narrative description of the unique baseline abilities and characteristics of the individual, and family members or long-standing caregivers who have known the individual for several years or more are usually the best equipped to do this. For younger people, a baseline description of abilities is something that could be compiled like a journal or a story throughout adulthood, documenting their story while the individual is thriving and doing well. Again, being in that proactive way. The next slide shows a tool that was developed by the National Task Group on Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices, and I have all of these things referenced in the in the presentation, and I can provide all of these things for you. They'll make these available for you later on. But if you look at the worksheet here, just briefly, it provides a framework that highlights 7 different categories of baseline ability that are important to track over time. And the baseline portion is best completed by someone who has known the individual for several years and can confidently describe or recall typical abilities and milestones. And then the current portion on the right is best completed by someone familiar with typical day-to-day abilities that are observed presently. So you can just see the different domains and take a peek at that.
Yep.
Okay. Is that something that you're using now, or is that something new?
Yes and no. I mean, these are factors that people take into account when preparing plans for services, for sure. It's nice to have resources like this when we're working with somebody in order to, to do that. And there might be families who have accurate records like this that are from school and things like that.
Okay.
But
this is a new form that you haven't necessarily seen before.
It would be a new form, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, and then another tool that can be very helpful is the early detection screen for dementia, and it too has been developed by the same group, the National Task Group on Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices. And it's important to see that it's an early detection screening for adults with IDD, and if they are suspected of or may be showing early signs of mild cognitive impairment. So this is something where we're using if we're thinking that there might be a problem. It is not an assessment or diagnostic instrument, so that's important to highlight. But can be a screen that can be used by staff, by care coordinators, family caregivers to know any functional declines. The purpose is to help identify and do the screening process, and then begin a dialogue between family members, direct support professionals, DSPs, and the medical providers. So one good thing about this actually is part of the mandatory cognitive assessment review that's part of the Affordable Care Act. And complies with some of the regulations, so it might be helpful. And there's a website where you can actually get the form. So this is just a quick slide again I just want to make sure we're cycling all the way through, because we want to be thinking about, is it dementia or is it these other, conditions that can happen? So I know as a nurse, when I'm doing an assessment, I am constantly cycling through, and we don't want to be premature in making a diagnosis about, or making a judgment about something one way or the other. So let's take a peek at this NTG early screening tool. So this is the first page. Sections 1 through 9 are pretty much just some, kind of demographic information and things like that you're probably very familiar with. Next, we're looking at, just some general characteristics. People, what is their current health? What was it 1 year ago? Looking at some mental health. And then again, any conditions that are currently present that we're aware of there. Significant or recent life events. Again, the example about that I gave about the gentleman who had lost a housemate and the depression. And then I did want to say one thing about seizures. So seizures, individuals with Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome are at increased risk of developing seizures, especially as the dementia progresses or it gets into the disease. And so it's important to be aware of this possible eventuality and to be watchful for any symptoms and act quickly. Caregivers should watch for any new sudden onset of a change in alertness, because a seizure isn't necessarily what we think of as a seizure. It could just be, a rhythmic jerking or unexplained staring spell. It could be, or a startled movement or an episode of a loss of consciousness that, very episodic that we don't even realize. So first-time seizures are not always witnessed, and it's important to keep the possibility in mind. And so if new seizure activity is witnessed or suspected, then further attention from a healthcare provider, of course, is recommended. And then the next page speaks to some diagnostic history. And then in section 18, really, that's kind of that narrative about what are we seeing. And you could go back to some of those warning signs that we previously reviewed. I mean, what are some things that you've been seeing? What are some behaviors that you've been seeing, or some lapses and things that might be helpful that are making you suspicious that this could be a possible dementia problem? And then the next section, starting in 19, really going over the activities of daily living, language and communication, sleep-wake patterns, and of course mobility. And I'm not sure if you use a form like this, but thinking about, this has always been the case where they've had this, or, oh, nope, it's getting worse, or not a problem, or doesn't apply. One thing I really did want to point out is in the area of incontinence. And as dementia progresses, bowel and bladder control also is affected. And so the development of incontinence can occur because memory impairment leads to difficulty interpreting bodily cues that indicate the urge to use the bathroom. It can be the inability to find the bathroom or properly ask for help, or even just some difficulty in sequencing the typical toileting routine about, just taking down your pants and sitting down and those sorts of things. But again, as we talked about the musculoskeletal conditions, that can also have an impact. So you can see where we're just constantly weighing these things. And then the gait, in ambulation, and there's gait and balance changes that occur over time due to the combination of memory loss and physical decline. And so memory impairment adversely affects an individual's ability to recognize and navigate his or her environment, to coordinate more complex skills like climbing stairs or stepping off a curb, or to be aware of even how their body moves and occupies space, a lot of things in perception. So again, looking at all those things. And then the memory section, I think it's important to realize that, we say here that most adults with Down syndrome, but to be honest with you, people who are, in the early stages of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, they really do not recognize their memory problems. It's typically a family member or, someone that knows them well that's starting to see these problems. And so they probably won't self-report. So some of this you might, will probably have to ask, a person that is familiar with them to bring that, to figure that out. And then again, some more information about self-reported problems, and which is important for them to be able to say, how are you feeling about this? Or, what are you experiencing? And then again, significant changes observed by others. And then the next couple of pages really go over those chronic health conditions that we talked about a little bit earlier. and noticing if those are things that are important. Again, important for that baseline.
Mm-hmm.
And then a little bit more about pain and discomfort, and we'll talk a little bit about pain later on, and sensory, and then other conditions that might be happening. And then the last page, I just can't stress enough, and I'm sure you all probably think about this too all the time, but medications are such, medication management. And so a thorough review of the medication list is so important. And especially aging individuals, I'm sure you see that too with your clients where they're seeing multiple specialists and doctors. And so I always say, I know my father has about 10 ologists. And so it's like, oh my goodness, he has medications from so many different people. And so getting that all figured out with one pharmacy and having a good list, and I'm sure you're all working on that. And I just want to highlight also making sure it's over-the-counter medications, herbs, herbal medications that people might be using, and even creams and eye drops and things like that, because those are absorbed systemically, and those can have effects. So sometimes we just don't think about those other things like that. And so, again, that medication review is a real priority, and to be very thorough and updated very frequently. How often do y'all do like a medication update? Is that?
I would say as a care coordinator, you would do it probably more frequently, but we do, from the state side, we have folks report their medications at the annual plan of care. Yeah. It's probably case specific. I mean, folks are aware that, that medications can affect everyking.
Yeah.
So it might happen more than that for people too.
Yeah. Well, and anytime you see anything new, immediately go to the medication list, because that could be there. So this is just a slide to talk about. I found there's just so much information on this website here, the AADMD. I would encourage you that if you're really interested in this topic, there are videos, and I watched a number of webinars myself to get ready for this webinar. Yeah. So it's just jam-packed with good information, and very current. Very current. So I was very impressed with this. So definitely spend some time there. So the next I wanted to talk about just following the diagnosis, but do we want to just take a second before we go in there to take do a couple of questions or a stand-up break or?
Do folks want to take a short break at this time? You can write in, or we could do questions. I know there's one question here. People are saying coffee, please.
Please, want a little bit of a break? Okay.
All right, so we'll do a 5-minute break. I'll just do that one question that was there. There's debate of the agency or the care coordinator should be doing the med update, since the agency can be administering or observing the meds being taken. The standpoint here today is really just the team.
Yeah, everybody.
It's really, I mean, I know that our forms require something, but we're trying to help give you more tools in your toolkit for noticing things and just calling the team together when somebody voices or, a family member says, hey, I have a concern, rather than the requirement for documenting for plans of care and things like that.
Yeah.
So, but I appreciate your comment. So let's go ahead and we'll take 5. We'll come back at 10:55, and we'll just be quiet here for a little bit and grab a coffee, and then come back and get comfortable for the rest of our presentation. Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Okay.
We're back, everybody, from our short break, and hopefully you got a chance to get a cup of coffee and get comfortable. We'll continue with our presentation. Just to make sure that y'all can hear me, would you please just go ahead and find that little hand and hit the hand if you can hear me okay? And give me a high five here this morning with the little hand, if you would. All right. Awesome. Good. Thanks. Most people are putting the little hand up, so I know that you can hear us now. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay.
All right. So if we've gone through all of this and there is a diagnosis, so now what? So the services and supports needed by the general population with dementia are the same as those needed by persons with IDD and Down syndrome. However, the understanding the nature of the person with IDD's non-dementia related lifelong disability is necessary to provide person-centered services and supports. And we were kind of just talking about that on the break, about how each situation is so individual and really requires the team to all come together. There might be some questions about sharing the diagnosis, and this is a wonderful little book that I found and would be something that might be helpful to you. But sharing the diagnosis is important that it be shared in words and concepts that can be readily understood. A lengthy discussion about the nature of the disease may not be appropriate for everyone. But it's important to look for an opportunity for a direct and honest discussion about the diagnosis and the effect it may have on the person. For individuals, explaining that the feelings of forgetfulness and confusion are due to a disease may even bring a sense of relief. And I find that even, with our clients who are not living with IDD, and once they can say, I have a disease, this is a chronic condition. People have diabetes, people have heart disease, people have lung disease. I have a brain disease, and this is a disease, and this is how it affects me. And so sometimes that's a real sense of by validating, those feelings that you're feeling frustrated, anger, sadness, and coping with this. This is hard, but we're here for you. Similarly, sharing the diagnosis, even in very general terms, with housemates, friends, and peers can be very helpful, as they may often be confused or scared by the changes they are witnessing. Friends can be a great support, and oftentimes they really want to be helpful. And so if they're given a basic understanding, again, that this is a condition, that this person, and they need a little extra help, people are, that they want to help. So allowing friends to be involved in the process can be a great way of letting them follow their own natural instincts to help, by allowing the individual to maintain lasting connections. And it may even mean that they can stay in their setting that they're in longer and not have to make a move. So it's important to understand that Alzheimer's and all dementias we happen to have a lot of visuals about Alzheimer's because that's the most common and the most that we've done brain imaging on. They're all progressive, but this can show you the difference between how progressive this disease is. And again, each individual will experience these changes in their own and unique way. This is just a quick snapshot. I'm not going to read this slide, but just for you to see, and we'll go over these in a little bit more detail later, but take a quick look to kind of just get the general sense of the disease progression and what that's like. So considerations for care. Once the diagnosis is confirmed for a person, the approach to care will require a real shift in thinking. We've got to adjust to the fact that this disease is progressive and ultimately fatal. Unfortunately, there is no cure, but with a focus on person-centered care, we can help to support the well-being of the person and their family, and they can have a very good quality of life. And I've seen just some beautiful stories that have emerged as caregivers and families all work together as the disease progresses. When striving to create a dementia-capable community, it helps for everyone to understand what's truly going on in the brain and the nervous system. I think for us to take a peek inside the brain, and it really develops some empathy for what's going on, and I think it really helps to decrease some stigma. So we have to remember that we cannot change the person who is living with dementia. We can only change ourselves, our understanding, and the environment. So one of the key features of Alzheimer's disease is a loss of short-term memory and ability to learn and recall new information. This is because of the effects in the hippocampus, the learning and memory center, and you can see the dramatic changes that happen. So the expectations must be readjusted to accept that the goal is no longer to teach new skills or to increase independence, which has been kind of in the forefront of what we've been doing when caring for this person. Traditional methods of offering incentives or rewards becomes counterproductive as they require the individual to remember the incentive. So typically we've done this cause and effect, and that's how we grow up. If you eat your dinner, you get dessert. If you work hard, you'll get an A. If you, so on and so forth. The ability to recall new rules is no longer possible for someone with Alzheimer's disease or dementia and can only lead to frustration for everybody. Similarly, attempting to negotiate with someone with dementia using logic or reason will only be fruitless and frustrating experience, as these skills are progressively getting more and more impaired. Behavior changes are often beyond they are beyond the control of the individual with dementia. Mm-hmm. And whatever they're doing, it's not done in spite of the caregiver, or sometimes we hear someone's being manipulative or things like that, but it has to do, again, with the brain disease, the neurons, the messages just are not happening. And so we have to be careful not to take that personal. Another thing that people don't realize that in dementia, especially in Alzheimer's, there are huge vision changes that would not be identified or seen in an actual eye doctor's office. Mm-hmm. The changes that occur are in peripheral vision, and you can see this is the occipital lobe and the great change, the vast difference. Just to get a sense of the changes, I want you all to do something for me. I want you to bring your hands to your eyes as if you were going to put on a scuba mask. I don't know if that if that makes sense, but just kind of bringing your almost like around like you would have a scuba mask on.
Like your hands are binoculars.
Well, not quite binoculars yet, but more like scuba. So you only have actually you do still have that center vision, but all your peripheral vision is gone. And that's the vision that a person experiences in the earlier stages of Alzheimer's disease. But you can see, even with that, a person, how they could become startled, or they might not realize that, everything in their environment or how their safety awareness is really affected. And then next, I'd like you to go ahead and bring your hands up and do binoculars, okay? So that's binocular vision. Again, you can see if you even try, you can't see, you can't see if someone would be messing with your pants or your legs or your shirt or something, and all of a sudden they might steal something, but they don't see you coming, and you can see how someone, again, might reach, they say someone's aggressive or they're agitated, but it's like, you surprised me or you're messing with me and I can't see what's going on. Mm-hmm. That's in the earlier stages or in the middle stages. And then finally, just close one eye and use your hand to create a monocular kind of a vision, and or like you were looking through a telescope. Okay, so just one eye, and that's the vision that a person experiences when they're in the late stages of dementia. So later, we always talk about how important it is to always approach somebody from the front. Mm-hmm. And to never approach somebody, surprise them from the back, never move the person's wheelchair without letting them know what you're going to do. Make sure that they can see your face, make sure they can, smile, and thinking about what stage they're in and making sure that they can see your face and see your expression. Another peek into the brain, you can see the big changes in understanding language. And so we could spend 2 hours just talking about all the changes that happen in the language centers in the brain and speech. But as you can see, it's a big change. And so people not only are not able to understand the words, what you're saying, but they also they aren't able to form the words that they used to be able, or to explain something. Sometimes they'll make up, they talk, kind of like a gibberish, or we call it confabulation or word salad, but it's because they're trying to search for the words that they just can't use anymore. And so it's always better to show and not tell. when we're trying to help people, a lot of times what we're doing is we're telling people what to do, da 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 da, and they are trying to, first of all, they can't understand that, they're trying to process that verbal input, but it's much better to show people than it is to, but also within their visual field. So by taking that opportunity to look a little deeper into the brain changes provided, we can get a little bit more insight that it's not only memory that is affected by the disease, but all of the person's thinking abilities. So over time, the disease affects each of these functions in judgment, the ability to consider a range of possibilities or make a decision in their best interest, or the ability to connect thoughts through reasoning and events. And again, that's, weighing pros and cons and cause and effect. The attention, just the ability to screen out distractions. And some of these are age-related and some of them would be dementia-related. Language, words spoken and heard, abstraction, ability to just the concepts of time and distance and relationships and numbers, and thinking about in the future. And then organization, just the ability to understand the sequence of steps involved in everything we do, everything from taking a bath to making a sandwich or something like that. And then perception, again, you can think about all those visual changes that people are having. And then also, the comprehension of language and things, and how much that can lead to misperceptions and misunderstandings and things like that. So important to, again, not, when we're talking with someone, not talk down to them like they're a child, or, use elder speak, what we call, we're talking to someone like a child, but to make information simple and broken down and allowing for people to get the information, take it in and break it down and then be able to respond. So because of all these changes, confusion is the central problem in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So it's not the memory, it's all of these things together that create this confusion, which profoundly changes a person's ability to keep the world ordered as they have known it in the past. Mm-hmm. And because the thinking abilities are weakened, the mind cannot manage all of the information it is receiving, and the person becomes confused. So I'd like to do a little exercise with you just to so that you, again, can feel or empathize with what that confusion must feel like. So we're just kind of look at the screen, and here we are on the Glen Highway.
Nice.
And I want you to imagine, it's winter, it's bad weather, you're driving your car, and it's your least favorite time of the day. The light is poor, and it's gray like this, a lot of glare from lights and things. And you're driving on your least favorite section of the freeway. What is that? The S curves, right, on the Glen Highway, lots of merging traffic and lane shifting. And the road conditions are horrible. It's icy and slippery, and the snow is, packing up on your windshield, and it's icing up, and your windshield wipers aren't working very well, and it's very heavy traffic, very little space between cars, and you're trying to keep up with the traffic, and so it feels like you're being forced to go faster than you really want to, that feeling where you're just like, I got to kind of stay with this, but I really don't want to be this fast. And then on top of that, you have a passenger with you, and she is very nervous about this whole thing. And so she's talking a mile a minute, very excited, not talking nonstop. And also she's got the car radio on, and it's loud, and it's playing some kind of loud music that's not your favorite. And your side rearview mirror, you see this 18-wheeler just about ready to pass you. So how do you feel when you're in that kind of a situation?
Write it in for us, folks. How do you feel when you're in that situation, driving with all those things going on?
And what do you want to do?
Write in your comments. What do you want to do? The first one says anxious. Mm-hmm. Overwhelmed. I close my eyes. I step on the gas. Nervous. Yep. Write them in. We'll read them out. Stressed. Get off the highway. Mm-hmm. Uneasy. I want to stop driving. Just get me home. Tense, anxious, and fearful. I want to pull over. I have no control in any situation coming. I'm trapped, scared, and tense. I ask everyone to be quiet.
And so, yes.
Terrified and anxious. I want everything to stop.
Yep. And so that kind of gives you a feel for what that must feel like when someone's thinking abilities aren't able to get some control over the situation. So I love the one where somebody said everything's out of control. And so if you're in this situation, what would you do? Pull over to the side of the road, or I think somebody said, ask my friend to pull off, ask somebody to be quiet, turn off the radio. But when a person has dementia or Alzheimer's, they can't do that anymore because their thinking abilities don't allow them to do that reasoning and to push that out. So if we look at the next slide, if you look at that white space as our thinking abilities, remember those 8 abilities that I had with the brain, okay? And typically when we're able to use all of our thinking abilities, we're able to push that confusion and keep it at bay. We have that, we have that ability to do that. But as the disease progresses, that feeling of being in a state of confusion is very scary. And I have heard people who are in the earlier stages with that confusion will say that it feels like I'm in a fog. Or I heard another man say one time, it's like looking through lace curtains, and sometimes I can see through them and sometimes I can't. And so that always trying to push that confusion at bay, keeping that confusion at bay. You can see the next slide. Again, the confusion encroaching in more and more and more and feeling less and less like you can use those thinking abilities. So as the person's cognitive abilities provide less protection from the external stimuli, there is that decreased sense of security and control and, anxiety and fear and anxiousness. And how do we all react when we're fearful or anxious or, we talk about difficult behaviors, but it's just a response to how the person is experiencing the world. So when we're working with people who are living with dementia, it's important to get a sense of the moment-to-moment reality of the life for a person with dementia. This constancy of confusion and how it's always present and always around the edges, and even has the capacity to become the central, controlling, and terrifying experience for the person. So confusion then affects the way people living with these conditions live in the world and how they interact with others. It's at the heart of many of the problems that caregivers face. And what family and caregivers see as what we call challenging or difficult behaviors are actually just a normal response to what they're living with. So our mantra at the Alzheimer's Resource Agency, and when we're doing any education, is that all behavior has meaning. And behavior equals communication about an unmet need. And so it's our job to figure out what the person is trying to tell us. As dementia care specialists, we are obligated to look at the behavior as this form of communication. The person is not trying to be difficult or make our lives harder, or be manipulative. They are only trying to tell us that they need something, and it's our job to try and figure it out. So we need to dig deeper. We need to peel back the onion. We need to be a detective. And we know from experience that there are many human needs that, if they're not met, can cause behavioral symptoms. So these are the top 10 unmet needs that oftentimes require someone that they're trying to let us know what the problem is. The unmet physical needs are hunger and thirst, or feeling tired or over kind of ramped up. Elimination, they need to go, or they did and they need help with getting cleaned up. Discomfort, and we had to think about just the things. I know when I came in the office here today, everybody was very concerned that I'd be comfortable, and the light, and they've offered a fan and offered me water and all those things, and a soft chair. So just temperature, texture, fit, senses. It's more than it's that whole environment, and just thinking about how that works. I know there was one lady that I used to take care of, and I would fluff her pillow, and I would do it at least 6 times before I would go, is that okay? Is that okay? Is that okay? And finally I would get a then it was just right. But we also need to be thinking about pain, because oftentimes that is very much in the forefront, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the emotional needs, again, of that confusion or, the fear, anxiousness, sad, angry, and loneliness, and boredom, just, not having anything in their life or things that bring joy. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. This is a good assessment of a pain assessment in advanced dementia. And I have actually heard people say that people with dementia do not feel pain, and that there is nothing more wrong than that. Everyone can feel pain, and it's frequently overlooked as a key contributor to negative behavior, poor sleep, or agitation. Because pain is subjective and thus dependent on the individual's personal experience and perception, the recognition of pain symptoms can be missed by caregivers and healthcare providers. Many individuals with Down syndrome have different ways of expressing pain throughout their lifetime. When Alzheimer's disease is present, the expression of pain can be muddled even further, and it is not practical to only rely on self-report of pain. And some people just don't understand those smiley faces and sad faces. You've really got to find something. So these more objective things, even though I oftentimes use these things just as, especially the grimacing or a frightened, expression, or the body language of, being tense or fidgeting, or all these things are helpful things for us to be looking at to see if a person is in pain. And, they might not be able to say that, their knee is hurting. They're just, they might just be hollering out, and it's all right. We have to kind of look at that and see what's going on. So look for those nonverbal clues of pain or discomfort, and look for any signs of potential pain sources when providing care. I often just think of someone sitting in a wheelchair for a long time, and they have a TENS on, and that elastic digging into their, the back of their leg. How long can a person sit like that? So looking for those clues and staying mindful of pain as a contributor for, again, what we would call, quote unquote, difficult behaviors. I wanted to just a quick note, again, I could do a whole 2 hours on the 3Ds. But it's important to realize that the natural progression of Alzheimer's disease is typically slow and steady decline over time. And so a sudden or abrupt decline or a rapid acceleration of losses is not consistent with the typical expected course of dementia. Therefore, any sudden change in mental status or physical functioning should trigger prompt medical attention to look for other root causes that brought on these new changes. I don't know how many times at the office I've gotten a call, and, caregivers, their confusion is so much more, and they're even thinking about, we might have to place this person in assisted living and so on and so forth, and it's a urinary tract infection. Mm-hmm. We've got done the test, and sure enough, and once we get that treated, the person goes back to, kind of their baseline. So it's very important to be watchful for any changes rather than the typical gradual losses. New changes in mood, sleep patterns, eating, or activities could be indicative of depression. Sudden or acute changes in mental status should be evaluated, as that could be delirium, which is a state of acute confusion and can occur with many physical illnesses. Adults with Alzheimer's disease are at greater risk of developing delirium. And oftentimes the underlying cause is something like an infection, dehydration, or medication side effect, and could actually lead to death. There is actually quite a bit of research that delirium is, leads to death. So we need to be, aware, we got to ask, is it dementia? Is it just dementia? Or is it dementia plus? Mm-hmm. And then it's so important to differentiate, because dementia, we want to be able to know, what the baseline is. We don't want to miss depression, because that can cause a pseudo dementia. And we can also treat depression with medications and, some social kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And then delirium, if we miss it, it can be fatal. There are some medications, treatments for dementia, but to be honest with you, I've been in this business for 20 years, and it's the same 2 medications that we've been giving for the last 20 years. So Aricept and Namenda are the names that you probably are familiar with. And they help with some of the symptoms, but they do not stop or reverse the disease. It's not like an antibiotic or something like that. It's just kind of helps with the symptoms, but eventually they do not have an effect as the brain atrophies more and more. And eventually, like I said, it's a fatal disease.
Yeah.
We also have to be so aware of the, all the ads on TV. Every time I see an ad for Prevagen and jellyfish, I'm like, oh, there was a lot about coconut oil for a long time and all different herbs, and there's really been nothing that is shown that makes a difference. And so we want to be careful. And a lot of times these things can also have interactions with the other medications that people are taking, especially if they have other chronic conditions. There was even like a claim about chelation therapy, which is an administered IV. We really need to counsel people about these sorts of things and really have them talking to their provider about other. I agree. Many times there are things that can be helpful, but we really need to be aware and asking, is this something that's helpful or not helpful?
Yeah.
So support this, I think one of our last objectives was to look at support and educational resources, not only for the family and client, but also for you as care coordinators and direct service providers. It's a big job. Holy Toledo. I was putting down, I was looking in a document about care coordination, and this was all the things that you are all taking into consideration. So, wow. And this is just a snapshot. And so there is there's all this, and then there's the support of the family and other caregivers who are trying to do their best for the person. And I think that's why it's so great that our, the Alzheimer's Resource Agency and looking at senior services coming together and thinking about how can we work together to support and encircle these folks. So one of the, I just want to say that this artwork, this was done in our Art Links classes that we do at Alzheimer's Resource Agency. And this was the same person who made this art of a sunflower earlier in the disease, and then also made a picture of a sunflower later in the disease. But what I ask you is, when the person made the picture, no matter what they were earlier or later, did they experience the same joy from creating the art? And they did, but you can also see that the big changes in the progression. So a comment from one of our caregivers was, just when I've got it figured out, she changes. And that is the awareness of the disease progression. So early stages for the individual experience, some of the symptoms, and those are some of the things we've, really talked about all before. Things you might see with the memory loss and telling the same story, asking the same questions, which can be very frustrating for caregivers. You're trying to find words, changes in abilities with the complex day-to-day ADLs and things like that. Sometimes those mood and personality changes that are difficult, and misplacing things, difficulty finding things, those sorts of things. For the early stage, for the caregiver experience, there's this disbelief, fear, anger, worry, a lot of impatience, especially when caregivers are first learning this understanding about not the cause and effect and not reasoning with the person. It's a whole different way of working with folks. And so a lot of times there's feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness. But the antidote for that is education and an honest assessment of the support system. Caregivers are getting started in this new role. But again, we can encircle them with lots and lots of resources and help. And so the way to empower the caregivers are to provide reliable information, tell people to stay off the internet, or at least give them reliable sources, which I will be providing for you about where to find reliable information. And then looking at your circle of support. And, in these early stages, thinking about future planning. And, I know you all probably work with POA and advanced directives and things like that. But if those things aren't in place, boy, now is the time to be thinking about those things and validating the individual and their family strengths, encouraging them. I know sometimes I'll have someone come into the office and they've just gotten the diagnosis. They're just really overwhelmed, and they'll talk for an hour straight, Holly. But at the end, I'll say, you are just doing such a good job. And you can just see the relief that, okay, I am, and just by the fact that you've come here today and you're getting information, that's huge. You're doing a great job, and we're here to walk with you through this. And so sometimes just that slightest bit of encouragement just really helps people get over that initial hump. In the middle stages, the individual is experiencing more difficulty. They're getting lost. They forget that they forgot. Yeah. Poor judgment. Again, really getting lost in day, time, space. Sometimes they'll get up in the middle of the night and they're getting ready for the day and, getting their lunch ready or something like that. And they don't realize it's the middle of the night. Depending a lot more on prompts and reminders. People do lots of little tricks to try and help themselves to remind things. So, as those are working, we use those and utilize those. Again, more mood and behavior fluctuations. Again, going back to that experience of the thinking abilities and all that confusion kind of encroaching on them. You can understand those feelings of agitation and frustration and restlessness. Sometimes because they're feeling lost, they'll wander. They're looking for where they should be. There might be an experience of hallucinations and delusions. If the hallucinations or these delusions are not hurting anybody or hurting them, for instance, I took care of a lady who used to look out the window and there were a lot of rocks and things, but she thought they were bunnies. And so she just used to watch the bunnies. It was okay. It didn't hurt anybody, even though I wasn't going to argue with her and say, those aren't bunnies, those are rocks. But, it doesn't hurt anything. And then looking at the physical changes, this might be where those new onset of seizures might come up. Could see some incontinence. And again, the gait being unsteady and mobility being more of an issue. So a lot of, chances for falls and some swallowing difficulties are going to start to surface here too. So choking and aspiration. So for the middle stages, for the caregiver, it may feel like their world is spinning out of control. They become the anchor for the person, especially when the person is feeling lost. That one person that they know, they are really going to hang on to them. And sometimes caregivers feel like they're so clingy, or they just can't get away. The person's requiring 24/7 supervision, and they're needing a lot more help with bathing and dressing. And some of these behaviors are baffling because they don't understand what their person's trying to tell them, or they don't understand about the community. They're just communicating what their unmet needs are if they haven't gotten the education that they need. And oftentimes caregivers are very inattentive to their own needs because they're caring for the person so much, and they are at risk for depression and problems. So empowering those caregivers, we helping them learn about positive communication. We have some wonderful classes that are all free at the Alzheimer's resource, and talking about positive approaches to care, and both both verbal but also physical kinds of ways that we communicate, ways to help and support people. Really helping people think about, what are the community supports. I know many times people say, oh, they would never go to adult day or something like that. But, down the road, I've often gone with families and we just had lunch there. And sure enough, the person actually fits in and enjoys it. And sometimes the caregiver's surprised, but they, and so thinking about those services, respite, really thinking about respite and what can we do. And then thinking ahead about alternative living arrangements, and then also the continuation of hobbies, interests, and for the caregivers themselves. We have a great class called the Savvy Caregiver, and it's 6 weeks long. It meets one time a week, and it really helps caregivers through a lot of this process. And then, of course, there's our support groups too, and that's a huge help too. And then in the late stage for the individual, you can see this picture here where, so much of the brain is affected. And so even now, long-term memories are affected. However, I'll say, there are some things that you can just, many times I've been working with someone who's very, very late stage, but the essence of that person is there. Mm-hmm. And, or there's been a song that we'll sing and they will remember some of the words of that, or there'll be a picture, or there'll be a touch that we know that person has that in them. This is maybe where a person will forget that, a person's name, or they won't know who they are, or they'll confuse that the caregiver is their mother, or the caregiver is it's their wife and they think it's their mother, or vice versa, their daughter. Lots of problems with language, very minimal vocabulary. Sometimes the only way that they can express themselves is through very repetitive motions or just making sounds. And then usually primarily wheelchair or bedbound here, complete dependence for personal care, incontinence, and a very limited visual awareness. So again, thinking about that monocular or even worse type of vision. So here in supporting the caregiver in this late stage, oftentimes people are feeling, they feel guilt. They promise someone they're not going to put them somewhere. And so helping them a lot, oftentimes I will say something like, you're not putting someone someplace, you're providing a loving, safe environment for the person. And so sometimes it's just reframing that for them, or helping them, encouraging them to research different places that's going to be perfect for their loved one, and being very involved in that process. And then looking at end-of-life decisions. And again, we could spend another 2-hour webinar on talking about those sorts of things. So, but thinking about the caregivers, thinking about timing and need of placement, when things get to the point where there's that total need for personal care, incontinence, sleep issues, family members really do need a lot of help, and we really need to be thinking about either placement or getting a lot of help into the home to care. And then thinking about hospice care, I think a lot of times people don't think about hospice care for end-stage dementia, but it is something that we can incorporate. Just wanted to talk about words matter. And I know that in your business and as care coordinators, you talk about person-centered language all of the time. And thinking about way back when we might have said, the word, the R word, retarded, we would never, ever say that word. But thinking also about, he's demented is something that is just, we don't want to use that word. We do still use the word dementia. There's a lot of people in the Dementia Action Alliance. These are people who live with dementia who are saying, can we call dementia something else? Mm-hmm. But it's hard because it's part of the within the medical community, and it's very hard. So we want to say, the person living with dementia, mm-hmm. or the person living with Alzheimer's disease. And I think when we actually get a diagnosis, it's more helpful to say a person living with Alzheimer's, or a person living with Lewy body, or a person living with, those actual diagnosed diseases, so that a person says, yeah, I have this disease and this is what I'm living with. So thinking about those words. It's also important to think about a positive approach, being very aware of our nonverbal communication. People living with dementia are like, they mirror your nonverbal. So if you come in with a serious look, they're going to be very serious. They actually did some actual research where they showed caregivers, this was in an actual, like a nursing home kind of setting, and they were looking at resistance of care, and people who were, in the non-resistance. And when they saw that the caregiver came in with a very serious look, or, just not thinking about their nonverbal communication, a lot of times there was more resistance than if the person came in with a smile, was slow, made a little chit chat first, those sorts of things before going to the task, so to speak. So really helping caregivers be aware of their nonverbal communication. listening for the emotion and connect on that level. If someone is just, beating their hand on their, and that sort of a thing, rather than saying, don't do that or stop that or whatever, saying, it looks like you're angry, you're something like that. Or if they're crying or something, you're sad, and sitting with the person in that. But smile and avoid negative tones in your voice. A lot of times that can be a real precipitous for a problem. These are, again, we do lots and lots of workshops at the Alzheimer's Resource about communication and how to best, use these skills. And so this is a quick slide on that. But the big thing I see where people can really make a change is do not quiz people. Don't ask them why. Don't say, remember I told you, or do you remember, or those sorts of things. Take the word remember out of your vocabulary when you're talking with someone with dementia. You can say, rather than taking a picture and saying, do you remember this? You can say something like, oh, this is such a nice picture. You must have been fishing, or you must have been, or whatever kind of a thing to start though. But keep the word remember out of. But important things, always approach from the front, never come from the back, remembering those changes in the brain, and always be at eye level. You can see if someone has visual regard for you. You'll connect. Always use the person's name, of course, their preferred, name, and identify yourself every time. Hey, Kara, it's Linda. Let them know. Sometimes we'll put our hand up by our face and kind of wave and kind of get that connection so they can see you. Always get permission before touching. Never come in and touch, but stay out in that kind of what we call that public space of 6 feet. And then once you see that they see you, then you can enter into that personal space that's about 3 feet out. And sometimes we'll even offer our hand like a handshake. And then once that person reaches out, you've got permission to enter into their space. And then you're into that intimate space. And then you can start talking about things like, a bath or, whatever, those sorts of things. Recognizing their abilities. You're doing so good. Oh, thank you for your help. All those sorts of things. Always giving lots of encouragement and helping fill in the gaps. People will be embarrassed that they can't do something. So rather than pointing out that they haven't been able to do that, and I think a lot of times, especially I see it with spouses, they've been married for 50 years and all of a sudden, one of the spouses is having trouble and you can hear the exasperation, well, why are you doing that? Or, and you can see the person's embarrassed. And so once the caregivers learn about the brain disease and they are able to see into the brain like you have been today, it helps them empathize and say, oh, this is the disease, and they help the person save face and that sort of thing. You'd be surprised how much humor, and again, not laughing at the person, but sometimes I'll use an old knock-knock joint or a knock-knock joke to break the ice with somebody, and they'll get that because a lot of times those are from, and so, or just like the humor in the moment, you're trying to do something and it's like everybody's sweating and and just all of a sudden we'll start breaking into a laugh and that sort of thing. So that's really being in the present, they are in the present. They're not thinking about the past. They don't have that cause and effect. They don't have the perception and the abstraction to think in the future. So everything is in the present, the now. And also entering their world. If for instance, sometimes someone will, they won't remember that maybe a spouse had passed away or a loved one had passed away. And rather than saying, oh, don't you remember, that they just say, well, you must be missing your husband, or you must be missing, or I just loved the way she smiled, or the great dinner she cooked, or something like that, rather than, because every time we tell that person that information, they'll experience that. It'll be like the first time they ever heard it. Okay. And I think I said a little bit earlier about say less, show more, because remember about the verbal abilities. This is just a slide about making sure that we plan for meaningful days. Remember, one of the unmet needs was boredom. So we want to make sure that people are having a good day. And so, researching, I'm sure you do this now in your care coordination, but thinking about hobbies and personal preferences and things that, will make for a good day for folks. Simplifying. I always have to give the example of a lady who loved to help cook in the kitchen, and she loved to peel potatoes and help with that. But then as time got on, it wasn't safe for her to use the potato peeler. So her caregiver used to just give her a plastic knife, and she would just rub those over the potatoes. So it was like she was peeling them or folding things, or things that are part of the daily life. And so here's some approaches, and really minimize the TV and the radio. Sometimes we see actual what we call catastrophic reactions even a day later. So we had a lady, for instance, that would be watching the news the night before with all the stuff. And in the morning, it was very difficult and was very resistant about getting cleaned up and getting dressed and all those sorts of things. When we turned off the TV at night and just was playing some relaxing music for her at bedtime, it was a completely different experience in the morning. So really look at all that stuff that's in the environment. I also want to bring up the power of music. You can see how that can make such a difference. And if you go to the next slide, if you as a group have not seen the film Alive Inside, have you seen this, Kara?
Yes, I have.
Yes, it's fabulous. And anybody that you can help create a personalized music list and watch this film, if you haven't seen this yet, I would say that it is well worth the time. And I've been incorporating it in so much of my own personal work and working with people.
It's awesome.
It is awesome. And so when caring for an individual with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease, it's crucial to remember that the person being cared for is still the same unique individual, still continuing on their own evolving and meaningful life story. The person living with Alzheimer's is always there, never eradicated. The disease makes access to his or her personhood increasingly difficult for the person and others. The illness progresses and affects the thinking capacities. But nevertheless, the person's life story is there, and we need to continue on with that. And so here are some community resources: the Aging and Disability Resource Centers, the Stone Soup Group, and this is the state group, but there's, it's all throughout the state, so you can contact them, and they can tell you for points of entry all over. Alaska Center for Resource Families up in Fairbanks, Special Olympics has lots of resources and things, especially for making that meaningful day. And then the Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska, these are all the things, like I say, consultations, people come in, and all of these things are free. I love working for the organization because everything I get to do is free.
Awesome.
And so, I just really encourage you to make referrals to us because there's so much that we can do. And I did want to highlight the mini grant program. Anyone who has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or related dementia is eligible for $2,500 every fiscal year. And so those things can be, and it doesn't have to be all at once. So a person could use $500 and then $700, it's cumulative, but then it resets again in July 1st. And so, please call us and we could help you through the process of doing that. And then more information that we will get out to you. Again, I would really look at, especially for this particular topic, looking at the NTG website. And then questions, and my last slide has all of my references for the program. So there we go. We have a
nice.
15 minutes here.
Nice. Well, this has been a big body of knowledge, and it's been very cool and interesting. I know that folks have questions.
Okay.
There's a couple here. We'll start with those. Please form your questions and write them into the questions box or chat area. Previously, there was a comment that said when we were talking about the brain, the effects on the brain, and how people are not going to be learning new things. They're going to be forgetting things and kind of, asking people to pursue new things and make those gains isn't really appropriate with this diagnosis.
Right.
It says this certainly poses a question for IDD waivers and group home goals. In our plans of care for our habilitation services, it's a goal-based service. So we ask for goals and objectives of care coordinators. It says, I have in the past used tolerate activities instead of learn. What are the thoughts on this? We would answer that keeping people current, otherwise known as a maintenance goal. I know it sounds weird when I say it sounds like a car or something. I don't mean that. But helping a person keep as current as they can with their abilities as long as they can, that would probably be something that would be goals in a goal-based service like that.
Yeah, and I would say like things like, if you saw in our resources, like we have art links and Mind Matters. And so, engaging them in some activities that are appropriate for the condition, and support them with the social network, making sure that they stay socially active. Yes. Would be really important because that staves off depression and things like that. Yes. And I've had folks come to Art Links who said, they're not artists. I don't want, and you would be amazed at what they create. You know, so sometimes we find the inner artist. Yes.
You can always find that.
Yes. Yes.
The comment says, I've heard persons with IDD and dementia tend to die young if they have Down syndrome with dementia. Most people don't live past age 65. Do people die younger with these?
Well, what I would say is that knowing that dementia is, eventually that is fatal and it is a progressive disease, that it makes sense that they would die younger. Yeah.
Yeah. A question from myself. I've helped people with IDD and dementia and Alzheimer's. I kind of noticed that their stages went very fast. It went from like nothing to all of a sudden the person was into later stages. Right. It seemed.
Yeah. Well, and
being a care person.
Yeah, and I've seen that with early onset Alzheimer's disease. So if a person develops the disease before age 65, so let's say they're in their 40s or 50s and develop it, they go very much more quickly. And so I'm thinking that that's the same because of that advanced aging piece on the chromosome 21, and also that it makes sense. Yeah.
Gotcha. Comment says, what about functional incontinence? I've had difficulties getting incontinence supplies for my people in the early stages. Probably my best answer for that is that if you have a diagnosis, then you'll have a provider who can write a prescription for those items.
Right.
And it really is just pursuing that through their provider.
Right.
And then the spelling and contact info of you.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I can write that in.
Okay.
His comment says, I appreciate the good information in plain English. I always appreciate good trainings. A lot of information would have been very helpful with a family member. Okay, I appreciate for my knowledge base. Thank you. That's for just a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much.
A review of a little review.
There we go.
Medicaid seems to not like functional incontinence.
Oh.
Yeah, if you have a case-specific question, too, you can always email us. You can email training. We can kind of help you puzzle that out. But, yeah, other questions and thoughts? Are you helping anybody with will it be available as a PowerPoint? We are going to work on making the presentation available to you. We're not sure exactly what form and format it's going to take. Please be patient with us on that. We have a couple of different upload and internet access nuances going on with uploading things and file types. But we're going to make it available to you. So you're here and you'll get one. Okay.
Yeah, it's ARD. Yeah.
And a good contact.
L Shepard.
Okay. L just like that.
Yeah, and then SHEPARD at Alaska.org.
Okay. I'm going to send that to everybody. Okay. And we'll go up a little. When we read these out, they're kind of small, and people kind of fire them right at us. So we get them in a list. The prescription requires 2 ICD-10 codes. Okay. Gotcha. for urinary and or bowel incontinence for Medicaid approval. Good hint. I would like to be able to share some of the slides, especially the pain and the ways to interact. Okay, good. Good to know. I don't have anybody with this specifically, but my caseload is aging, so I anticipate the information is good to have just in case. Thank you for this training, and have a great weekend. Thank you. Not a question, but a very big thank you. That was interesting and easy to understand. Well, great.
Well, great.
We appreciate your feedback and your review of us.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes left. We have about 8 minutes till the top of the hour. What other thoughts do you have about this topic? Do you anything new for you, or questions specifically for Linda? A few of us were thinking about how, the forms that we fill out and state requirements, and thinking about how those things, how we can use this resource to be better informed to request services for people. Most of us are care coordinators here.
Yeah.
So maybe there's something along those lines. Other reviews that you have awesome training. We've asked for training from Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska. They were awesome. They came and visited the individual's team and helped with personalized support.
Oh, great, yeah.
So that's a resource for you. If you're working with somebody and they're caregivers, whether they're, your Medicaid waiver reimbursed DSPs, or whether they're family or both, or the whole shebang, they can seek training through ARA.
That's something else I'll suggest or mention, is if you have a situation where people are living in a group setting, we can do something that's called dementia care mapping, where we can look at the environment and how the person is responding to that. And we actually do behavioral and engagement codes, and we do that every 5 minutes for like 3 hours. And then we're actually able to put that into a software where we can actually see kind of some charts and graphs about how the person, it's very objective, but it really helps us see what is helpful for the person and what is
great
not
data.
helpful. Yeah, it's awesome data. It's really very,
Does it include the environment too? I mean, we learned in the past to keep the visual and the environment that the person's in most of the time at home, to keep it simple, to not have too much clutter around.
Right.
And sometimes people would get upset at things that were familiar to them because they knew they were supposed to be familiar, but they weren't familiar. So we would kind of remove clutter and personal items. Sometimes it sort of backfired. People would say, "You stole my thing," and then sometimes it worked. So, but generally keeping it simple was the best way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we talked about, keeping a lot of, walk in, sometimes there's a TV and a radio, lots of stuff going on. But that tool definitely helps us see what in the environment is affecting, how it affects the person.
Yeah.
Because we actually,
that's really great data.
It's very interesting.
People were impressed with the brain anatomy changes pictures. Folks are saying, my caseload is also aging. I have a client who has a close friend who may be experiencing dementia. It was useful to hear about how to support her in her friendship with someone who may be experiencing dementia. It's all part of that social realm. Yeah. It would be good to educate staff and families about what the hippocampus does and how it will affect. I gained good information that will really assist me on my care coordination. The greatest obstacle I found among family members was she won't remember anyway, so why bother with activities, etc. Do you have a resource to recommend to help communicate with them? Probably right on the screen there is a good resource, right?
And we talk about in the Savvy Caregiver something we call contented engagement, meaning that we want to create that the person is engaged and content, because when they're in that middle space there, they are not bored, which can create some, I put that in quotes, difficult behaviors, and all the person's trying to express is, I'm bored, or I can't stand this anymore, or they're overstimulated. And so it's creating the best day. Activities is not about remembering them. It's about the present moment and what the person are they having the best moment that they can at this time.
Yeah, and those kinds of statements are more so just the reaction of a caregiver with the differentness of their person, whether they're,
Right.
the
Exactly.
paid caregiver or the loved one.
Yeah.
So that person needs some help to understand what's going on, and
Right.
it really is just a request for more information,
Yeah.
I would think.
Absolutely.
And we treat it like that, and that would
Good.
be kind of like the caring way to
Perfect.
bring them
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
Comment says, as I am older, I've seen so many changes for those with disabilities, from institutionalization to community inclusion. It's so wonderful to see such effort being made to help these individuals and their caregivers continue to provide care, and understanding that it improves well-being.
That's great.
There's a great point made about reframing, providing an individual with care and not putting them away somewhere. It's the power of perspective. It's very good for care providers as well.
Good.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, we're just coming up at the top of the hour here. We just have 2 minutes left, so I'm not seeing any new comments come in or questions. I want to thank everybody for attending our session today. I'm glad that you've learned so much, and it was a very engaging presentation, and we got to practice, and we got to make goggles, and we got to do all kinds of things and to understand these things. Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska continues to provide excellent training in our community with the important work they do. And I want to thank you, Linda Shepard, for being here and sharing. It's been a long journey to get here, involving an earthquake. We were supposed to do this on the day of the earthquake, and then so here we are. We had a couple of technical burps before we started, but that's okay. We got over all that, and we've gotten this great knowledge. So yes, it was a fun session. My office mates thought I looked funny with my hands on my face. All right. Well, with all that being said, I'll go ahead and bring our session to a close. Please stay tuned for our materials and our recordings in whatever formats they turn out to be. We're going to do our best to get everything to you as soon as we can. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Enjoy your weekend, and we hope to see you again online in our trainings or in person for our CEH Care Coordinator education hours. You will receive a certificate that says CEH right on top of it by email. Probably give the system a couple hours to chew them up and make them, and then that should come automatically to you. If you don't get something, or if it looks funny and you can't open it, just email us and we will help you. Okay? All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.